Hello, my name's Ashley and welcome to the third video in our React video tutorial series. In the videos we've gone over so far, we've just been looking at ReactDOM.render, and the only things we passed through to ask React to render were things like strings, numbers, arrays, and the only thing that achieved was creating text nodes. What we want to do now is start passing through JSX, things that looks like this. And what that's going to allow us to do is to create DOM elements. All the DOM elements we can see here, anything we want, enough to make our to-do app. So let's get started. Okay, what is JSX? Let's do our usual. Let's just try and play around with it in the console. So open up the console here and paste it in. We get a syntax error. That's because JSX isn't part of standard JavaScript. It's an extension onto JavaScript. This can be a bit confusing because sometimes when you're seeing it being used, it is just being used in a .js JavaScript file, and we're not getting any errors here. And that's just because it's such a popular extension now that a lot of editors have built-in support for it. So they'll recognize it and treat it as if it is standard JavaScript. But to actually run this code, the JavaScript has to be transformed into something that something like a browser can actually run. My favorite tool for being able to see this transformation and start to get some intuition for what it's doing is actually the TypeScript website. If you go to the playground, it's got a place here where you can type in some code and then it will show you what that generates on the other side. So if we go back here and then if we take our JSX, go into here and paste it in, we can see what that would get compiled into. And you don't have to use TypeScript. There are other tools that do this. This is just my favorite. A few things to, if you want to try this out yourself, a few things to double check are that the JSX config of TypeScript is set to React. And just an FYI though, I've put this little thing at the top just because if we don't have that, then you also get a lot of TypeScript errors where it's saying this doesn't exist and this variable doesn't exist, doing all its TypeScripty type things. That's a little bit distracting. So I've just told TypeScript to ignore doing its actual type checking. So that means we can actually focus on just the direct transformation from JSX code to normal runnable JavaScript. Something we might be able to immediately see is that this JSX has actually been hiding a bit of the React API from us. What we can see here is there's a React.createElement that we kind of didn't know about before, and also a React.fragment. So they should really be on our to-do list because they have been part of this API. When we said we were going to look at JSX, that was hiding these things. So let's add those. Fragment React.createElement. The other thing we might think of is, hang on, we're using TypeScript. Why did TypeScript know that we were using React? And again, that's just kind of because React is so big and popular that that's just the default. When you use JSX, TypeScript assumes you're using in React. But you can change that configuration. And so here we can imagine this is kind of the defaults, and I could instead say here Ashley.createCake. We can see here that all those React.create elements now say Ashley.createCake. And this React.fragment that seemed to come out of nowhere, we could replace that with Ashley. Well, we could just, there doesn't have to be a dot. We could say eat cake to replace that. There's already quite a lot going on, so let's maybe try and reduce this down a bit into something a bit easier to get our heads around. So I'm just going to start deleting a bunch of stuff, and then let's also put this back into a React. Okay, so this is, well, we know this header class variable doesn't exist because TypeScript was complaining about that earlier. So this looks like our HTML, so I'm just going to edit it as if it was HTML, and I'm going to delete the thing that looks like a HTML attribute. And here we go. This now is starting to look a little bit more manageable. This h1 here has ended up as the first parameter to create element, and our to-dos text content inside our header element has ended up here. So let's now take this and jump over to the React website, where we know that React is available in the global scope, and we can now actually start running bits of this JSX. So we've taken JSX, it looks like this, converted it into runnable JavaScript, and we can actually run it. So we can see, the first thing we can see is that it's not created a DOM element. It's created something else, which is a little bit interesting, because this does kind of look a little bit like document.createElement. We could do, if we just look at that first parameter, it looks a lot the same. When we run this, that actually created a DOM element. So it's not doing that. It's creating some other type of element. It's creating, according to this symbol, it's creating a React element. And we can see that it's got a type. It's taken this first parameter here as h1, remember that. And the to-dos are in something called props, and it's called children. We can see that this element has a key and it has a ref. There's an awful lot we can already see going on. And keys and refs we will come on to in a later video. I think I know what you're all thinking. You're thinking, let's take this and combine it with the React API we're already familiar with, ReactDOM.render. So that's exactly what we're going to do. What's happened? What's happened is we've gone full circle. We've started with JSX that looks like this, converted it into standard JavaScript. We then passed that to ReactDOM.render, and then when we rendered that, our document now looks like the JSX we started with. Let's now see what happens when we call render multiple times. So it already says to-dos. Let's now make it say something else, which it's done. But it looked like h1 flashed, which maybe we're thinking, oh, did React throw away the old header element and create a new one? That doesn't seem very efficient. And it's not done that. It's h1 just flashed because its children were modified. And I can kind of prove that by, if I add an ID to this header, and then if we render again, we can see that the header still has that ID. So React didn't delete the old one and create a new one, because that new one then wouldn't have had that ID that I'd manually added. So even though h1's flashing, it really is React only updating the bit of the text that has changed. What if we actually did want to add an ID to our element? Well, let's go back to our little TypeScript compiler and see what that would look like. So here I've added an attribute to our JSX in the same way that I'd, so it looks just like adding an attribute to HTML, and that's generated this JavaScript. The attributes here have ended up being converted to a plain JavaScript object and passed through in that second argument. So if we now take this and render that. So all that's changed here really is that second argument's changed from null to now an object. And if we do that, as hoped, React has taken this and seen that we now want a ID attribute of test. And only that bit actually flashed when we did that render. If I do this again and put something else here, only the attribute flashed. So again, we can see here that React is trying to just update only the bits that have changed. Let's now take a step back and actually see what happened when we called createElement like this. It's created a React element like before, and props now contains children, to-dos, and ID testing. So it's actually kind of merged these two things together into one internal concept of props. This does mean we can actually do something a little bit odd. If we go to here, we can do this, where we can kind of abuse this. This is more, I'm not saying you should do this in your code, but kind of just a proof of concept to kind of conceptually get head around kind of what's happening here. So let's not have this here, and we've added a second attribute. So here we now have that object that used to just have ID test. It now has ID test and children. If we take this, so this definitely doesn't look like kind of normal HTML anymore. But if we render it, then we actually, that does still work. I can say children, and that works. From React's perspective, the two are the same. One thing to kind of bear in mind, this, like if you're having some bug and someone is doing this kind of children's, passing this children's through as like an attribute, if they're doing that and then also putting something here in between the two tags like this, so that you end up with children here and also the third argument, then the third argument wins. So we're passing children through here directly, and then also passing some more children through here. If we call that, the object it's created only has this one that's passed through. This prop here, this attribute, has been ignored. But it's kind of a quirky thing that may be useful to know about. One of the things that makes the DOM so powerful is that we can nest things. So what if I want to put elements inside my elements? Again, let's go back over to our TypeScript to kind of see what this could look like. So let's say that inside this header, I want another header. Quick aside, I don't know what I'm doing here, putting a header inside a header. I'm just going to blame the fact that we've been having a heat wave this week and I've barely slept. A better example probably would have been something like this, where you have an article and inside that article element you have a header and a paragraph. So apologies for the header inside a header. The kind of concepts that we need to cover, it kind of doesn't matter, but yeah, you don't want to be putting headers inside headers. That doesn't make sense. And if we look over now on the right side, we can see that it's kind of just this recursive pattern of this bit here, is just called the same thing again, create element, following the same pattern, the h2 there, and the children. If this looks a little bit confusing, we can actually shuffle this around a little bit. And this is one of the things that you might hear people say about React is just JavaScript. The templates aren't magic. They're just kind of a slight twist on standard JavaScript syntax. So you can manipulate it in the same way you could manipulate standard JavaScript syntax. So let's do that. Let's take this bit, this parameter that we're passing to this function. If this was just JavaScript, we can move it out. So we can do that here. We can take this argument and move it out. And we can now take this here and move it out, though we have to change it slightly because up here, if we say up here, TypeScript doesn't know that this bit is JSX anymore. It kind of needs something like this to kick off changing it over into that mode. So we actually now have to turn this into our string ourselves manually. And inside here, if we now want to say, okay, we want our text and our header. But if we do it like this, we're trying to refer to things, we can see it's literally just put those in as text, because that's the default behavior. It treats this like as if it was close to being HTML. So the syntax here, when we're actually trying to write JavaScript inside our kind of HTML-like syntax, is we wrap the bit of JavaScript in curly braces. And we can see that that is now no longer a string text, it's referencing our variable up here. And we can do the same here. So header2 right now is currently being treated as a literal string of header2. And instead we're saying, no, I just want to refer to this variable up here, which contains this element. And we're passing those through as the third and fourth argument to create element. So create element, you can just keep kind of passing it more and more things as arguments. It's variadic in argument length, and these are all just treated as more children, all siblings of each other. So we can take, I want to take this, and we can actually store this last bit as well. That might be easier. We just call that our final template. Take this, go back over here. So we could run this first, like here. So we've got our header2 and our text, and if we look at the final template, then inside it has props, children, and then the children contains that other element with the h2 header. And now we can do render, just pass through that template React element. Here we go. So we've got h1 to-dos, and inside h1 we've now got our h2 with the return. So the HTML representation of our document matches the original JSX that we started with. Something I'd like to try and make as clear as possible is that even though JSX looks like HTML, it's not HTML, and React isn't converting it to HTML. HTML kind of isn't involved in this whatsoever. This is being converted into JavaScript objects, and then React is using those JavaScript objects to work out what are the correct methods to call on the DOM object API. There is no HTML going on. It's getting the DOM elements as objects and setting properties on those objects and doing everything at the DOM API layer. JSX it wants to look like HTML because HTML, designed 30 odd years ago, its purpose was to be good for humans to be able to read it. We want machines to be able to understand it so they can actually create websites, but we also wanted humans to be able to look at it, be able to write it and look at it and also understand it so that it would be a kind of a friendly thing to use. And it's probably that is probably why it became so successful. So it's always worth just remembering that what we're doing here isn't HTML. What we can do now is actually start combining these kind of bits of knowledge we have already about JSX and start doing quite a lot of things. This is one thing that I quite like about JSX, is that because you can just embed JavaScript inside it, we don't need any new special syntax on top of what we've kind of already covered to do things like having conditional bits. So say here I want maybe only sometimes to have this second item. So instead of needing to learn some special syntax, I can just use what I already know and use JavaScript to do this. So we could say here our second item is null, and we can take this out, and I could say like if some condition, then now second item is this, and here second item. And then this would work. This I would say, if we just kind of think about how this would render in our heads, this second item, if this was false, now that in here, second item will be null. We know from earlier that null means to React, just leave this bit blank, don't create any DOM elements. Or if this is true, one of the children will now be this extra React element, so it will get created. So we didn't need to, we can here just use the same things we already know from writing JavaScript. So we also know that this is quite verbose. So we know we can reduce this down into something that even kind of looks a bit like a template that did have special syntax. Let's say here I've got the condition, and we can say condition and this. So this is kind of a common pattern in JavaScript, kind of the kind of dynamic typing aspect of it, that I can say, look at this condition variable, and if it's true on an and, then this will now return this from this kind of whole expression. So that will end up evaluating to this, or if condition is false, then this whole condition will evaluate to false, and we know that false acts like an empty. So we can already do conditional bits of the template without needing to learn any new special syntax. Maybe people aren't familiar with this pattern in JavaScript, but it's kind of a common JavaScript pattern that doesn't just apply to JSX. It applies to the whole language. The other thing we might want to do that's very common is like looping over things, especially here when I've got list items. And again, we can just use, we don't need special syntax for looping. I can use JavaScript. So I can say my items, the fact also that in the earlier video we looked that we know that ReactDOM.render can handle arrays of things. So we can take items and say like this. We can say in here, I want my items. So this would work. I can put, I can pass React children. I can pass, the children for this React element as an array of things. So, and then I can produce this array using kind of the normal array creation methods, things like kind of map and filter, reduce, flat map, all those things. So let's change this to say, instead I've got first item and second item. Then here we can say, I want to map over that array of strings, and then for each kind of string, say this, I want to have a list item with that text inside it. So we can think, if we're trying to run this through in our heads, if we actually ran this JavaScript, we're going to end up mapping over this array of strings and end up with an array where each array has a React element inside it based off the item that we were looping over. So this would end up being exactly the same from React's perspective as if we just had that array of elements. React doesn't know we're using map. All it knows about is what this eventually ends up, the value this eventually ends up being. So you can kind of think of this as there's some value that we create, and then we give React that value. How that value was created, React can't know about, and it kind of doesn't care about. We can build up these templates in the way that we think just makes the most sense for the particular problem, like the way the kind of product's described, or the way we think our colleagues might think. We can write the template in the way that we think is just the best JavaScript mix of this HTML syntax and JavaScript syntax that best describes that template. Cool. So it may not seem like it, but we actually know enough of the React API that we can start to create a little bit of our to-do app. We probably could create the whole thing, but because we're limiting ourselves to just kind of the bits of React we've covered so far, the code is going to look a little bit odd, and the more of the app we create, the kind of odder it's going to look without much gain. So what have we got here? So we're doing the same stuff we've already been doing. We've been creating our React elements, and then we render them. And now we're just creating kind of a few more than we were in the past. And I've wrapped up all this code just in a function called render. Could have called this whatever I wanted. Just calling it render, because we're going to want to, like as we've been doing, we want to call render multiple times to update the DOM. So, and every time it runs this, it's going to, the state lives outside of that function. So this state kind of, has some sort of persistence. So when things are in here, so as I modify the code, it's automatically reloading the page. So if in here I said there's already something in the state, then when this renders, then it's already creating this and jumping straight to the render of that state. Obviously, when someone's interacting with an app, they don't want to change the code and reload the app. We want this. We want this to be happening when the user clicks the button. So that's what we're going to do. Let's start this empty, and then have a function that we call when we click the button. You'll notice that there's this fades in. So the CSS has just been set to make everything fade in, all elements fade in when they're created, just so it's obvious, immediately obvious, kind of which bits of the DOM are being created. So we can see if React's ever doing something bad, like throwing everything away and recreating everything. Because that's, when I load the page, everything fades in because it's just been created. So now when we click this button, we're going to use the types of APIs we do in our vanilla apps, just because we haven't kind of covered enough of the React API to not do it this way. So when we click this, we need to go get the real, so this is just the React element. So this won't know the value that's typed into here. We have to get the actual real thing from the document to work out what's been typed in. Then we can remove this bit of text, we push it into our array, and then we just call render ourselves manually right now. React doesn't know anything about this array up here. It's the fact we've pushed into it. There's no callbacks on arrays that React could listen to. And as I said earlier, React doesn't know that we're mapping over this array. All it ends up with is a new array with all these list items. So right now, whenever we change that bit of state that we were using, we're just manually calling this function again recursively so that we run all of this code again. So let's give that a go. Type some stuff in. I click add. That's getting cleared, and we've got a new thing. And only this is fading in, so we can see that all this stuff up here isn't being recreated. Even though we're creating the React elements, we've got to remember those elements are just telling React, this is what I want the DOM to look like, and React's comparing those to the previous React elements, and then only creating DOM elements when it needs to. So when we add things in here, this is all running again every time, and then it's just creating that one new DOM element. This doesn't particularly look that nice, and this is where that JSX kicks in. So we can kind of do the reverse. We can take kind of just calling this API directly, which you can do, and it works. But what we want to be doing in our React apps is take that code and instead use JSX to write it. So this is exactly the same as what we just had, in terms of creating all the same values, but we're just doing it all together using JSX. So it kind of has all the advantages of HTML in terms of how easy it is to glance at it and see the structure and see what's going on. But it's exactly the same as what's happening here, and this works exactly the same. A few little things that we didn't cover that I've snuck in. So this input, we've got this slice here, just like in HTML, things can self-close. So this is exactly the same as this. Like it generates the exact same code if you ran that through the kind of TypeScript compiler or the Babel compiler. This and that are the same. So it's just a nice little kind of shorthand syntax. And the other thing is, here we were always passing strings. We're always doing things like ID, well, this thing above it here, like ID is this string. When we want to pass JavaScript values, then that's where we've got to use like the kind of usual pattern of when I want to use JavaScript inside my HTML like syntax, you jump to writing squiggles. So now I can actually pass my JavaScript values through to this on-click prop. So yeah, snuck those bits in without properly covering them. But hopefully they're kind of simple enough that makes sense. I think that's good enough for now. Oh, my glasses are so reflective. I think that's enough for this lesson. We didn't come on to React.fragment, so I'll do that in a separate video, just kind of keep it a bit more isolated. But hopefully we can now see what JSX is doing, and definitely recommend just sitting, using that TypeScript website or the Babel website. That's a similar type of thing, and just kind of write bits of JSX and then just have a look at what it generates, because I think doing that then makes using JSX feel less intimidating, because you can just see that it is just function calls, creating values, and then composing those values together. And the fact that React.createElement is not really doing anything more than it's just creating objects, and they're just plain objects with some properties and some values. It's just taking the things we pass to createElement, wrapping them up in a little object so that we can give that to React. And just like when we're giving React arrays of strings and numbers, it's comparing those React elements to work out what are the actual DOM APIs I need to be calling to get the document to look like all those React elements and text and numbers that it's been given. So yeah, hopefully we kind of are comfortable with what we've covered so far, because we say the next thing we do is just going to be building on top of this.